Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I say good afternoon, but of course I have absolutely no idea when you are watching this. I can tell you it's 8:30 in the morning right now and I haven't had quite enough coffee, but we are going to soldier on here. My name is Alex George, and I'm thrilled and honored to be the guest speaker at this year's Legacy Luncheon in support of the Mid-Continent Public Library. Of course, I would much rather have been talking to you in person rather than recording this 2 hours drive east of Kansas City. I'm actually speaking to you from Skylark Bookshop here in downtown Columbia. I'm always delighted to speak at any event that supports libraries. And as you may have noticed from my accent, I am not from around these parts. I grew up in England in a small town called Marlborough, which is in Wiltshire. It's about 70 miles west of London. It's near Stonehenge. It's a pretty place. And a couple of years, I took my children to the library there, which is quite literally a stone's throw away from where my parents now live. They say that sense is the smell is the sense most closely connected to memory, and I can believe that. It must have been at least 30 years since I had last walked into that building, but the minute that we walked in, those 3 decades just fell away. And you know the smell that I'm talking about: paper, ink, cardboard, books. I simply love the smell of books. And this library smell brought back a memory that I had completely forgotten. Now, I went to boarding schools from an early age, and the libraries in those boarding schools were bountifully stocked, as libraries of well-funded and expensive schools should be. But during the holidays, I would troop down to the local library and carry on feeding my reading habit. But, and this is what I had forgotten until I went back, there was one awful summer when I must have been about 10 or 11, when, horror of horrors, I lost my library card. Now, we had none of your fancy scannable barcodes back then. My card was just a deep blue cardboard pocket into which you inserted the cards that were tucked inside the inside cover of books until they were checked out. Everything was filed manually in what I'm sure was an extremely complicated system. And the librarian at the time was, to my rather anxious 10-year-old mind, a ferocious lady who spent the day unsmilingly wielding her date stamp with what appeared to be unwarranted ferocity. For some reason, she seemed very reluctant to issue me with a new card until she was sure that I had looked absolutely everywhere. So I turned my bedroom upside down several times. I went through every pocket in every pair of pants that I had. Nothing. The librarian, however, remained unconvinced and unmoved. And finally, I had to get my mother to come down to the library with me to petition for a new library card. And I had become a little bit intimidated by this lady, and she had, probably rightly, become rather exasperated with me. But that day, as we approached the desk, she looked at my mother and me, and to my complete astonishment, gave us a slightly sheepish smile. And then, with a flourish, she produced my old card. And it transpired that the card had been filed for those long, bookless weeks under the name of a mythical character called George Alexander. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the perils of being burdened with 2 first names. Today, I'm to talk to you about my new novel, The Paris Hours, which came out in May of this year. And the book is set over the course of one summer's day in 1927 in the French capital. And the novel is really 4 stories which are interwoven in alternating chapters. And while the stories connect and cross-pollinate with each other, each has its own principal character. And I had originally thought that I was going to write a very different book. The idea to write about Paris at all came to me years ago when I was driving home after my ritual weekly humiliation on the indoor soccer pitch. And I hobbled to my car and gingerly climbed in and turned on the radio. And as I set off for home, the last lush and romantic bars of a piece of music filled the car. And when the music finished, the announcer, in the dulcet tones of NPR announcers everywhere, began to tell the story of the piece, which had been commissioned by the Russian impresario Serge Diaghilev for his Parisian ballet company, Les Ballets Russes. And the piece was written by Maurice Ravel. And the announcer explained how Diaghilev assembled a team to work with him in putting together his groundbreaking productions. And the names on the list on the roster of the people who he collaborated with was just astonishing. He had Debussy and Stravinsky and Ravel writing music, Picasso and Braque and Matisse painted backdrops for him. Jean Cocteau wrote the libretti, and even Coco Chanel designed some of the costumes. So I sat behind my steering wheel, stunned. Out of nowhere, I had my next book, Serge Diaghilev and his extraordinary coterie of geniuses. So I began to read everything I could about Paris in the 1920s and the painters and writers and musicians who lived there. I consumed histories and biographies and cultural commentaries. The post-war period in the city was a time of unparalleled artistic brilliance and saw an explosion of creativity, the impact of which still resonates today. So I spent my days of writing and research half a world away and 100 years away as well. And I'd gone to school in Paris when I was 13, and I also worked there for a year as a lawyer in my early 20s, and I was just thrilled to be back. And then I sat down and I wrote an entirely different book. And here was my problem. As my research progressed, I began to wonder if I would ever really be able to do justice to the collective genius of the people that Serge Diaghilev had got together. And then I started to question whether their stories really needed to be told by me at all. After all, if you listen to a Ravel melody, or if you look at a Marc Chagall was another person who had painting backdrops for him. If you look at a Marc Chagall painting, the art speaks for itself. And I wasn't sure whether they really needed me to speak for them. But I wasn't ready to leave Paris just yet. And I began to wonder if there was a different thing that we could do, because I was fully invested with Paris in the 1920s at that point. As a writer, I'm subject, as we all are, to my own preoccupations. And I am drawn by my own taste to quieter stories. And so I redrew the focus away from all of that dazzling genius and decided to tell, for want of a better word, more ordinary stories. There is Guillaume, a lovesick painter who is hopelessly in debt. And there is Soren, a refugee from the Armenian genocide, who is a puppeteer and who performs for the children of Paris in the public parks in his own language. There is Jean-Paul, a journalist who tells other people's stories because his own is too painful to tell. And finally, there is Camille, the maid of the great writer Marcel Proust. And the story really began with her. As part of the research that I did about Paris back then, I read the memoir of Céleste Alberet, who was Marcel Proust's real-life maid. And she wrote that he once asked her to burn all of his notebooks. And I began to think, well, what if one of those notebooks was saved? And then I asked myself, and what if there were secrets in that notebook that everybody thought had been destroyed? And from that small seed, this whole book grew. As I said, I lived and worked in Paris, and I know the place quite well. But writing about Paris is not without its challenges. After all, there are already more books and movies set in the French capital than there are croissants in the city's boulangerie. In the first half of this year alone, for example, in addition to my book, there have been at least 3 other novels published called 3 Hours in Paris, The Paris Library, and Paris Never Leaves You. So it's a big market already, and some people say, oh, I'll read anything set in Paris. But then other people will say, oh no, not another book set in Paris. So it's something of a double-edged sword, to say the least. Although I will say that one silver lining of this pandemic is that a lot of people finding themselves housebound have turned to my book and books like it to do some armchair travel through fiction. I've received several emails from people whose once-in-a-lifetime trips to Paris were cancelled because of COVID-19 and who chose to read my book instead. Now, obviously, any book about Paris is not the same thing as actually going yourself, and is a poor substitute for the real thing. And I'm never quite sure whether I should be grateful or apologetic when people send me those notes. And of course, everybody knows Paris, or at least they think that they do. For a start, the city's symbol is the most recognizable architectural structure on the planet. And writers, when they write about Paris, are faced with a very particular challenge. You want to offer a fresh perspective on some of those well-worn cliches and give the right reader something new and unexpected. But at the same time, you need to show readers enough of what they already know so that they feel comfortable. And so there's always a balance to be struck between those two approaches. So to achieve a new perspective, I decided to set the novel on the streets and in the parks where real Parisians live and work, away from all those famous tourist attractions. So we don't see the Arc de Triomphe or the Champs-Élysées. The Eiffel Tower does occasionally get mentioned, and it's there in the distance, but the French are just a little bit bemused by it. And as for making Paris recognizable, well, one of the ways that I did that was to sprinkle some of the well-known characters that I had been researching before and put them in the story. So over the course of the novel, we get to meet people like Josephine Baker, Ernest Hemingway, and Gertrude Stein, and other famous Parisians. But by design, they exist very much on the periphery of the novel and not at its heart. This was, though, the first time that I have ever used real-life people as characters in any of my novels, and it was an interesting challenge for me. When you write about actual people, there's an obvious and unavoidable tension between the need to represent their lives properly and to tell the story that you want to tell. And how a writer performs this balancing act will depend, at least to a degree, on each person's philosophy. All writers fall somewhere in the spectrum between total disregard for historical fact and an obsessive need to get every detail exactly right. Personally, I try and strike a happy medium. I think of my stories as a single thread that I have to lay upon the tapestry of history. Now, the thread can go where it likes, but it's important that it always blends in with the background. The writer E.L. Doctorow said something which I thought was very smart. He said, "A historian will tell you what happened. A novelist will tell you what it felt like." And this feels right to me. We read novels primarily for their emotional truths, not factual accuracy. And that, to me anyway, is the most important thing. For me, historical fiction is all about the possible, about what might have happened. It's our jobs as novelists to find the gaps, the caesuras in the narrative, and then we can leap in and fill those. For example, in the book, there is a scene where Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway have a rather ill-natured squabble in a bookshop. Did that argument actually take place? Were the words that I put into their mouths actually spoken? No, of course not. I made it up. But I do know that by 1927, those two writers were at loggerheads with each other pretty much all the time. And so it could have happened. So the thread of the story is still blending in to the tapestry behind. Most of all, though, my loyalty lies to my reader. Specifically, I think it's my job to tell the best story that I can. And where things become interesting is where the story that you want to tell and the established historical record come into conflict. When that happens, every writer needs to find ways to resolve that tension or to find a way to live with it. For example, when I originally wrote the book, the maid, Camille, was actually called Celeste. In other words, I used the real maid's name. I intended to present her as who she was, that is to say, a real-life character. But as the story developed, I edged further and further away from established facts about Celeste's life. until I realized that I no longer felt comfortable using her real name. And as long as I did that, I was representing that the story that I was telling could have happened. And once that was no longer the case, I felt that I had no choice but to change her name to Camille. And once I had done that, I felt that I had new license to tell the story that I wanted to tell, and I no longer needed to worry about such fidelity to history or to a real person's memory. Ironically, Marcel Proust himself was notorious for using his friends and acquaintances, including Celeste, in fact, as characters in his book, quite often thinly disguised as well. So at least there is a good precedent for this kind of thing. And there's another way that the spirit of Marcel Proust haunts this book. The title for his masterwork is usually translated in English as In Search of Lost Time. And this could be taken as the subtitle for the novel. All four of the book's principal characters are looking backwards towards their past, searching for something that they have lost. Writers often return to familiar ideas or tropes when they tell stories. John Grisham likes to write about lawyers, J.K. Rowling about wizards. We write about what obsesses us, at least I know I do. And I realized a while ago that ever since I became a father, more than 19 years ago now, all of my fiction has, to a greater or lesser degree, been about really just one thing: being a dad. Parents, children, siblings crop up everywhere in my fiction as I try and work out what these relationships look like and how they work. And it was only when I had finished The Paris Hours that I saw that this book is absolutely full of these stories about what it means to be a parent or not be a parent. And most of all, what can happen when that closest of relationships is severed. There are connections missed, connections broken, and perhaps saddest of all, connections that are never made. I'd like to finish, paradoxically, at the very start of the book. The novel's epigram is from a famous short story by James Baldwin called Sonny's Blues, and I'll read it to you in its entirety. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. When I read these words, or rather reread them, I realized that they brilliantly captured the essence of what I was trying to do in this book. My protagonists are not the famous characters who swan in and out of the novel, but they don't need to be. Everyone has a story, and as Baldwin says, it must always be heard. And he's right. There really isn't any other tale to tell. Thank you very much.